You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and we have a very exciting interview today with Cornelius Dönnhoff. We've been working very hard to have a German Riesling producer on for some time now, and to start with one of the best is a very big treat for us, and hopefully for you as well. We also have some interesting news for the week, so before we get into a little bit more about Cornelius, let's talk a little bit about a couple articles that I found interesting from last week's Vint Marketplace news. The first article is something that I've been getting deeper into personally as I've continued my MW studies, and it is titled, "What's the Difference Between French and American Oak in Wine?" And this was an article in Food and Wine, and I thought it was a really interesting breakdown because it was very approachable without give you a lot of information without getting too in the weeds. They give you a general overview about oak and its role in wine. They talk to some winemakers. But what I thought was very helpful is they have this chart that also gives you quick, fast facts. So it talks about how American oak is typically the species Quercus alba, whereas French oak is typically Quercus robur or Quercus petrea. It talks about the density and how tight the tannin or the wood grain is. So basically they're saying that American oak is loose grain in terms of the grain in the wood, whereas French is moderate density and tight grained. They also talk about how they go on to impact the wine, noting that American oak has a bold impact on the wine with upfront sweet, toasty aromatics, whereas it takes a little bit longer for French oak to have an impact on the wine, and this imparts more subtle aromas and yet finer structured tannins rather than maybe as overt as some American oak. And then last but not least, they go into a little bit about the aromas, talking about the lactones, kind of the vanilla coconut notes that you get from American oak compared to the more reserved aromatic profile of French oak, imparting more of that nuanced, earthy cedar and baking spices. I think the article, for anybody wanting to learn a little bit more, maybe pull out a fun fact or two to share at your next wine party or cocktail party, I think this is a perfect article for that. I just thought it was really, really fascinating and a great, easy to digest overview. The second article I wanted to highlight for this week was from James Suckling's website. He calls it his 2025 Oregon tasting, but it was really a review of the 2022 vintage. They go over a ton of different producers, a couple of which one is Beau Ferrer. They get some quotes from Mikey Etzel, who we had recently on the podcast. Go check out his episode. They also have a photo with Tomas from Lingua Franca. So you can also go check out his episode, another friend of the podcast as well. But what's really cool is they break down the vintage, talk about some early season difficulty, including some frost and some other stuff like that. But then they were talking about how basically the vines were resilient throughout the year and the wine that came out was exceptional. So I'm really on the lookout for some 2022 wines. Definitely read through, try to find some producers that the Suckling team recommends, and yeah, go find yourself some Oregon 2022 wines. But yeah, that is it for the news for this week. We will pivot over now to Germany to Cornelius Dönnhoff. Cornelius, it was a great person to talk to. He's another one of these in the series that we've talked to, like Mikey Etzel, who is now the generation that's been taking over from his father. He's been at the helm for a little longer than some of the other recent folks that we've talked to, like Jean-Frédéric Hugel. He's transitioned about the same time. But Cornelius gave us really cool insight into their single vineyards, what makes each one unique, a little bit about the style of the producer, a little bit about their history. Donoff as a whole, if you're not familiar with them already, I'm sure many of you are, is an icon in German wine, set up there in the Nahe region. I'm probably still not pronouncing that right, but better than I was. Before our conversation with Cornelius, I was saying Nahe, so Nahe is close or closer. But it's really interesting to hear his kind of thoughts on the difference between these wines and the wines of maybe that are grown in Mosel or over in the Rheingau. So it's really deep dive into kind of those nuances, but then diving even deeper and deeper into the nuances of each single vineyard. We also go on to talk about their approach in the winery, which is very, very hands-off, not necessarily in a natural way, but they do only what needs to be done to allow the fruit and the purity to shine through from each site. and they employ a couple different sizes of vessels, but that's about it. It was really fascinating, and I'm really excited to go out and find some of these single vineyard wines, maybe ones that I've had already and can revisit, or some that I've never had now that I have a little bit more insight into what makes each vineyard unique and special and where they are in relation to each other. I hope everybody enjoys this interview as much as I did. And now, without further ado, here is Cornelius Dönnhoff. Hi, Cornelius. Thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we've been working hard to have, and I think you are actually our first German wine producer. We had Terry Thies on back in December, and he talked about all of his favorite producers from across Germany and Austria, and we were really excited to try to get some folks. So we're excited to have Dönnhoff, which is probably, if not the biggest name in Germany, one of the most famous. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Terry is a good friend of the family. He visited us since basically the 80s, and we have a good connection. So yeah, happy that he recommended me.
Yeah, of course. Well, could you, your family has a storied history, and I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with you, but could you give a little background on the family and maybe on you and how your role is increasing in the winery?
Yeah, of course. The Dönnhoff family, basically. So my family, we came here to the Nahe region. We don't know the exact date, but around 1700, something like that. And during that time, it was not because of winemaking or anything like that. Basically, they were miners, because here in our area, we have very mineral rich soil. And basically just there's a mountain here in Oberhausen where they were mining mercury, basically. Yeah. And over time, wine was here since the Romans, basically. And then some of those basically started, growing some wines, which was more or less like a secondary income or something like that. But during that time, it was around 1750. It was more like a traditional German farm. Yeah. So we had growing some crops to feed the family and have some animals and stuff like this. And also a little bit of wine, which was basically the income. So it was, sold, not bottled or anything like that. So completely with the barrel. Yeah. And then, a little bit of income. And that went on for a couple of years. And then around 1880, or between 1880 and 1900, my great-great-great-grandfather basically started focusing more and more on wine. And he was also the one who started then bottling the first bottles in the 1920s and selling then bottles. But during that time, it was still like a farm. So we still had animals and growing some other stuff. And then this went on again a couple of years, and then basically until my grandfather together with my father took over. And then they were basically leasing out all the other farmland and were completely focusing on wine. During that time, very, very small, obviously 5-6 hectares. Yeah, very small, typical winery. And my father then took over in 1971. And from there on, he increased the vineyard sites. He was lucky to take over the winery in a time where he had the possibility to buy all kind of different great vineyard sites around here, because other wineries didn't have any children or something like that, or had struggles, I don't know. And basically he started then increasing the winery, focusing more and more on single vineyard sites with Riesling. And then when I took over, I basically did the same, and I'm doing running the winery since now 2007, so nearly 20 years now. And and today I'm having around 30 hectares on more or less 10 different concrete vineyard sites.
Yeah, it's interesting as we talk to producers who they're maybe second or third generation. They got the wineries from their grandparents or from their parents, and that's definitely one. Maybe there are some challenges related to that with maintaining the legacy and stuff. But it's not every day that we talk to someone who their family's legacy is over 200 years old. But really, the modern day Dönnhoff is from the 70s, from your father. Is that correct in saying, or how do you think about do you think a lot about the 200 years of history, or is it really a modern era that you find yourself in maintaining?
I'm not running around and thinking every day that we have a history of 200, 250 years.
Sure, yeah.
No, of course, I'm living in the here and now, and what I'm doing today is my job. But of course, history, it's nice to have it. I guess in general, farmers or people who are working with the nature, we write a lot down. So we have like old records, really like from 1780, where they were recording, for example, okay, this year flowering was very bad, or we had a great vintage, and stuff like this. And it's nice to have something like this in your background. And now and then I read those things and just try to remember or just to visualize basically how they were doing it during that time with all the modern machines and stuff like this. And it's nice to have, but of course I'm living now and totally different times, and it's nice to have it in the background basically.
Yeah, might have missed it, but how many hectares do you guys have now today?
32.
About 32. Okay.
Yeah, more or less. So it changes always a little bit because we have some vineyards that we're replanting, and then we have some land that's not planted at the moment because we want to give it a little bit of time, plant some cover crops a couple of years. So it changes between 28 and maximum 34, something like that.
And do you have plans to continue growing that? No. Tell us a little bit about why.
I only have two hands.
Okay.
Yeah, it's time management, obviously.
Yeah.
Of course, if I drive around the Nahe region, here and there are some vineyards I'm super interested in, and I would love to make wine from those vineyard sites because they have old history or other people making great wines from those sites, but I can't do everything. So I'm focusing on those vineyard sites that we're having. And at the moment we're having, for our team and for the family, we have a perfect size. Yeah. And no need to increase. Yeah.
Could you tell let's hone in a little bit where in Germany you are. And also I realized I've been saying Nahe my whole life instead of, I guess, Nahe.
Yeah.
So good to know from the horse's mouth here. But could you share a little bit about like where it is in relation to the other major wine growing regions in Germany, and then what makes, the Riesling from the Nahe different than, say, Mosel or Rheingau?
Yeah. Okay. So basically we just south of the Mosel and west from the Rheingau. And in terms of climate conditions, it's also a little bit of a mixture of those two regions. So the Nahe is in general a little bit warmer than the Mosel, but not as warm as the Rheingau. And that means basically that in our area, we have the possibility at the moment with the climate that we're having to produce high-class dry wines. Yeah, because in the steep low slopes, we get like the physiological ripeness that we need and just super nice aromatics. And at the same time, we have similar cool nights like the guys that are having on the Mosel or on the Saar River area. And this gives us the possibility to increase, world-class off-dry wines, because we can keep the acidity quite high because of the cool nights. So it's a little bit of a mixture of those two areas. And the other thing that is maybe unique for the Nahe is that we have all different soils on a very small space, basically. So we have everything from like volcanic soils, slate soil, sandstone, quartz, even limestone. So it's the soil changes here constantly, even if you go like only 100 meters to the next vineyard and suddenly you have a completely different soil. And that makes it, for me as a winemaker, extremely interesting because we have the same weather and same clone material and stuff like this. But on the other hand, the soil is completely different. So that gives us an extremely big influence of the finished wine.
That makes a lot of sense. You make a lot of single vineyard wines, you make some like general wines. How many single plots are you vinifying as their own? And are these all just like the Grand Cru or the Grosses Gewächs that you're making on their own and then you're blending everything else? Or how do you go about selecting what goes where?
Oh, Jesus. Okay, that's a complicated question, yeah. As I said, so I have 10 different sites, more or less, that we use with the vineyard site name on it. We have more vineyard sites, which we blend together in the estate Riesling, But the other ones, my father once said a sentence, he said once, every vineyard has a talent for one type of wine. And that's true, We have vineyards where, for example, the acidity is always higher, and we don't get the highest sugar ripeness, for example. Leistenberg is such a vineyard, yeah. And in this vineyard, it's perfect for off-dry Kabinett wines. Dry wines there would be too acidic, yeah, and you wouldn't find the balance there. And that's the reason, for example, in this vineyard, we only produce one wine, and it's a off-dry Kabinett. Then we have other vineyards with the opposite way around, yeah, where basically it's much warmer, lower acidity, perfect for dry wines, but off-dry wines nearly never work, only in certain vintages. So, for example, in Norheim, the Delchen is such a vineyard. It's much warmer and get riper grapes, and this is a perfect vineyard for dry wines. And over time, basically, we figured out, okay, so in this vineyard, this type of wine style works best, and in the other one. So it's learning by doing, and you need a lot of experience. And over the years, you figure that out more or less. Yeah, but it's not like we don't have kind of a business plan or whatever you would call it. Yeah. We try not to interfere so much with nature. We try to, even I have sometimes a plan in my head what type of wine I want, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't make sense to chase it. Yeah. So then I have to change, not nature has to change. Yeah.
Yeah, that comment fits with what I was planning to ask, which is basically how have you seen demand for your wines vacillate between demand for off-dry, demand for dry. And I guess what you just said is like, we make the best wine in whatever style relative each year that we can, and it might change. But do you think a lot about, we're seeing a surge of demand for off-dry, for instance?
Yeah, that's what I said. So I'm not looking really at the market or something like that. We're not following any trends or something. So, for example, we have sometimes vintages where 70% of the whole vintage is dry because it just worked better in that year. And then we have other vintages like, for example, 2010, crazy high acidity, perfect for off-dry wines. And then there it was the other way around, yeah. And of course, I'm not I don't know, I always tell people here in Germany, I'm not selling any chairs or anything like that. So basically what we try to do is we try to capture nature, so the growing conditions on 1 year, and put it into the bottle from different vineyard sites. Yeah. And this changes from year to year. So in some years it's more dry and some years it's more off-dry.
Do you see, like, Germany has always, like, the domestic market, you guys have always drank more dry Riesling. I feel like in America, they're just not coming around. Obviously, sommeliers and connoisseurs have been drinking dry Riesling for years, but have you seen you exporting more dry wines than you had in the past?
Yeah, definitely. So over the last maybe 10, 15 years ago, it started slowly that we're talking now about the US, that they started importing more and more dry wines as well, yeah. But this is a good question to ask Terry. Why? Because he was selecting the wines, yeah. But I guess it was a little bit like, okay, off-dry wines are so unique, you can't find them anywhere else. So that's why we buy it from Germany. And dry wines, even dry Riesling, you get like from Alsace, from Austria. There are a lot of places in the world, New Zealand, Australia, that make great dry Rieslings, yeah. And then everybody was maybe like, okay, we import dry Rieslings from somewhere else, but when it goes to off-dry, it will be German.
That makes sense. Briefly, for some of our listeners who may not know, I think most of them probably will, can you walk us through a little bit of the levels of on the Prädikat side and the different levels from Kabinett all the way up through Auslese and Baron Auslese?
Yeah, of course, again. So in the beginning, I have to say the Prädikat system was more or less established in 1971 when the actual German wine law was like written new, yeah. And the Prädikat system tells you basically at what kind of ripeness you have with the grapes. Yeah, so you have the corridor in Germany, we measure the ripeness, the sugar content in Öxle. Other countries, it's like Brix or Beaumais or something like that, yeah. And you have a different corridor for each Prädikat. During that time, it was extremely difficult to achieve like a Spätlese or a Auslese level, yeah, sugar ripeness. So my father was fighting for ripeness. Today, I'm fighting against ripeness. So it changed completely. So the wine law today is not really relevant anymore, because even in vineyards that are not good and in places where normally no wines should grow, it's easy to have a Spätlese level. And nowadays, like most people associate with the predicate system more like a factor of sweetness in the finished wine. Yeah, but that's actually not right. But that's most of the time what people think, like a Kabinett, you have this light sweet wine. Then you have a Spätlese, it's a little bit more powerful, a little bit sweeter. And then, of course, Auslese, more sweetness, maybe a little bit of botrytis grapes. And then, of course, the Auslese or BA or TBA or ice wine, those will be sweet, yeah. But in general, I can take like Spätlese quality grapes and ferment them dry. And then it would be a Spätlese trocken, Spätlese dry, yeah. But nowadays, we in the winery or in the VDP, I must say, we don't use the predicates for dry wines anymore. We just use it for off-dry wines. Yeah, just to make it a little bit simpler to understand because, yeah, German wine law is extremely complicated.
Can you tell us a little bit more about maybe like the quantities of each level maybe you produce? I guess it's probably focused on Kabinett, Spätlese, and Grosses Gewächs. And then also I'd like to hear, have you guys, or at least has the region, had an ice wine vintage in any time in recent decades?
Wait, once again, can you ask this again? I wasn't there. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. We'll just start with the easier one. I'll throw the ice wine thing in later.
Yeah, because that's complicated.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so for the different styles that you guys produce, can you give us like a general breakdown of the percentage of your production that falls into each kind of category?
Yeah, and that's a little bit tricky to tell because once again, it has to do with the vintage and the weather that we're having the year. But in general, at the moment, we're producing a little bit more dry wines, maybe like 65% of the total production is dry. And from the dry wines, I would say, yeah, more than 60% is like basic, the entry-level estate wines, like the dry Riesling, or we have another one, which is called Tonschiefer, which is a type of a soil. And then the rest is then basically split up between the different single vineyard sites, like the GGs or the Erste Lage wines. And here, once again, it depends a little bit on the vineyard and on the vintage. Yeah. And then the rest is off-dry. Off-dry is similar. Most of the stuff is basically for the estate Riesling. And then the second biggest chunk is for the Kabinett, and then a little bit of Spätlese. And it depends on the vintage if we are able to make some Auslese or BA. But this is like a very, very small percentage. Yeah.
So for in vintage to vintage, is the primary difference like the heat for the year? Are you having significant types of, what are the main disease pressures, or is it more of, does botrytis come in properly, or does it only come in a little bit?
Yeah, that's super complicated. It can be everything. It's not just a little bit of sunshine and some rain now and then, yeah. So it's everything, daytime temperatures, nighttime temperatures, sunshine hours, obviously the rain, when it rains, spring, summer, autumn. So it's tricky. Last year was a vintage. We had a extremely bad frost in April. That was super challenging. The year before was extremely dry and no rain during the summer. This year so far looks super promising. So we had just having the right amount of rain, and it's also not super warm at the moment, which we like. Yeah. So every year has a new challenge, and it can be, yeah, everything. And disease-wise, yeah, similar. So sometimes we have years there's nearly no pressure, and then other years we have to, yeah, be in the wines and be super careful all the time because the disease pressure is extremely high. Yeah, there's no correlation really. The thing what we are seeing is that weather phenomena that we're having getting more extreme. So if it's hot, it's really hot. If it's dry, it's extremely dry. If it rains a lot. Yeah, and this is something we didn't have like maybe 20 years ago. Yeah, that changed completely. So we have to be super careful, basically, what those things. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just from my wine nerd side of things, when you're having disease pressures, is it primarily mildew, and are you seeing any like issues with like trunk disease or any of those type stuff as well?
Oh, I guess it's a little bit like from everything. Yeah. Sometimes we have a year that we have extremely mildew pressure. Other years it's other stuff. So once again, has to do with the weather. If it's rainy, if we have foggy autumns or something like this can happen. Yeah. It's really hard to say. So every year is completely different, basically. Yeah. But it would be nice to have a vintage again where it's a little bit easier. Yeah, to be honest.
Very cool. Very cool. So I guess going through this, I think people always say that the mark of a great vineyard is that even in the tougher years, these vineyards always perform. Can you talk a little bit about maybe a few of your standout vineyards? I think here we've listed Schloss Felsenberg, Obenhauser, Bruck, Niederhauser. Can you just talk about some of your top
Yeah, of course.
vineyards?
Let's do those three, Brücke and Hermannshöhle, because those three are extremely interesting. First of all, they're very close together. So everything happens here in a stretch of 600-700 meters. Yeah, they're not far away from each other. But all those three vineyards are completely different. Yeah, in Schloss Böckelheim is extremely steep south-facing vineyard side, and here we have 100% volcanic soils. So porphyry and mellow. This vineyard is extremely tough in dry years because we nearly have no topsoil. So super challenging. Every year we have to bring in a lot of like organic material like straw, compost, stuff like this to increase the water storage capacity. Yeah. So extremely difficult to farm, except in wet years. There it's super easy because all the water runs away, so no problems there. And this vineyard is quite warm, and also during the night it's quite warm because it's like we have a lot of like those volcanic stones lying around, and they store the heat from the day and radiate it during the night. So one of those vineyards which is perfect for dry wine. Off-dry wine works, but only in certain years, but it's a benchmark every year for dry wine. Always a little bit like, the wines are a little bit harsh, especially when they're young, yeah. You need to know how they develop to really, appreciate those wines, when they're young. It's like an annoying baby, basically, like a screaming, annoying baby when they're young. But they develop in the most beautiful person over time. And then you move like 300 meters down the river, and then we have the Oberhauser Brücke, which is our monopole, and at the same time the smallest classified vineyard in the Nahe region. So it's only 1.1 hectare, and it's classified as a große Lage, so as a Grand Cru. And this one is not on the steep slope, so it's at the bottom of the valley and close to the river. And that means we have a completely different microclimate. So during the day, it doesn't get so warm like in the steep slopes. And during the night, it gets much colder because it's at the bottom of the valley. So all the cool air from the surrounding mountains flow into the valley and cools it down. So that means basically extremely long ripening phase. Basically this is the vineyard we always harvest the latest. It has one thing that's challenging because it's so close to the river. We have always like a high humidity, and that means we get every year botrytis. Even if it rains or it doesn't really matter. We get botrytis there all the time. And this makes it a perfect vineyard for off-dry wines. Yeah. So cooler means higher acidity with an extreme late harvest. So we have a super physiological ripeness without a high sugar ripeness and a higher acidity. And it's perfect for Spätlese, basically, yeah. And the botrytis that we're having in there, we always harvest like separately and make like an Auslese or BA or TBA if it's possible, yeah. And then from the soil type there, it's extremely complex. So we have similar volcanic soils like in Felsenberg, but we have also like slate. And then all that stuff that the river over the thousands of years led there during a flood. So you can find everything like from loam, quartzite, limestone. It's like a super complex type of soil. Yeah, so it changes constantly. When you walk just one row through the vineyard and you look down, and it's like every 10, 15 meters, a different type of soil. And it's extremely interesting for us again. Yeah. And then another 200 meters down the river, then Hermannshöhle. Yeah, that's basically since over 100 years the best rated vineyard in the whole Nahe area. It's a mountain that is a little bit like cone shaped. Yeah. And it means basically we have everything from like southeast, south, southwest. So the sun wanders around that mountain. Yeah. And in this vineyard, we can basically produce both styles, dry and off dry. So in the middle part, the south facing side, this is everything, or here we harvest the grapes for the GGs, for the high class dry wines. And then because it's warmer, riper, perfect for dry wines. And then the southeast and southwest side, it's a little bit colder. So in one side we have only the morning sun, and the other side we have only like the evening sun. And here acidity is once again a little bit higher. And here we harvest our Spätlese wines. Yeah. So Hermannsville is a vineyard where we can produce, both styles of Riesling. And then from the soil, this is 100% slate soil with a little bit of limestone. And so completely different from Felsenberg. And all those 3 vineyards are like in a range of 500-600 meters. Yeah. So that means same sunshine hours, same rain. Yeah. More or less the same kind of climate. But the wines that we harvest, they are completely different, and it's based from the soil, basically.
So it sounds like what I took from that, a lot of it was that you are deploying you have to think about a lot of different things with each vineyard. You're deploying a lot of different tactics for managing each vineyard year to year. How much of that, just to make sure that your decision making is right, involves collecting data from the vineyards and throughout the season? And what does that look like for you guys in terms of gathering information during the growing season?
Yeah, it's experience at the end of the day, and gathering information. That sounds so technical, but we have eyes and we walk around the rows and up and down, and then we just look, and that's how we make our decisions. Yeah. We don't have like a book laying around, which is, I don't know, wine growing 101 or something. So it's all of experience, and we know how we have to farm all the different vineyard sites. Yeah. So things that we do in Felsenberg would be completely stupid in Hermannsville. Yeah. Because we know it doesn't make sense and it doesn't work. And of course, that is maybe the good thing to have such a long history over the generations and over the years. We did a lot of mistakes. Yeah. And obviously mistakes you remember much better than the things you do good. Yeah. And at the end of the day, that is how it's worked. Yeah. It's most of the decision making is really based on experience, and also a little bit of a feeling for the year, a feeling for the vineyard. And then you make your decision. Yeah. You just look at them. Okay. How are you looking? Are they healthy? How's the growth going? A lot of growth, not so much growth, stuff like this. And there's so many small variables. And then, of course, I talk to my team every day. I can't be in every vineyard every day. Yeah. That's not possible. But I have an excellent team, and everybody there is really into it. And I call them sometimes 4 or 5 times a day and just talk to them and get their impression, what they think. And this also goes then into my decision making at the end of the day.
That's funny that you say you don't have a winemaking handbook. I do, and that's the difference between a podcaster and an actual winemaker, which I think is hilarious.
And also, there's always stuff you have to learn and things I don't understand, but some things I don't want to understand. Yeah, some things I want to have that personal touch of making wine. Wine for me is such an emotional kind of business. Yeah, it's like raising a children, and you make mistakes on the way. If I would make a perfect wine, I would stop. And there's no sense, anymore after that. We try to make not too many mistakes during the year.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, you have to be, you're still testing sugar and acidity out in the vineyards and things like that to verify what your gut decision is, or you're not doing that. I'm just thinking you have a bunch of different sites that all require a different approach. That was the core of the question.
Yeah, no, they have a different approach. Of course, if we're getting closer to harvest, at some point we measure some things, sugar content a little bit. But even there, the most important thing is something we can't really measure, or we measure it, but we measure it with our tongue, and that is taste. Yeah, and that is something we can't really influence. So we have to find like this. We have to wait until we have the aromas there where we want it. Yeah, and if it's then at 11.5 or 12.5 potential alcohol, I don't really care.
Yeah. That's why I was bringing the book up. It's interesting because I can read about all of these things, but when we talk to actual winemakers, some of it comes down to intuition. A lot of it comes down to experience and just understanding what happens in your specific site. So that makes a lot of sense. I had 2 other vineyards I wanted to talk about too, that I just thought sounded interesting. One was the Kirschek. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And then the other one was the Hallenpfad. Both very different. The Kirschek one, 100 years old. It says it's one of the most historic vineyards in Nahe recognized. In what sense does that mean? Since things have been planted there since going back to Roman times. How is that?
Yeah. Okay. So here, this area, as I said in the beginning, so we have winemaking here since around 2,000 years. Yeah. And they just found like another Roman kind of villa with a kind of old Roman press house, like in the neighbor village. And they just dated it around 2,000 years. Yeah. So wine here is like that since a very long time. But in Norheim, the Kirschegg vineyard, which is funny, Kirschegg translates to cherry hedge. Yeah. And in the past, there were a lot of like wild cherry trees growing, and from far away, it looked like a big hedge. And the thing is, like, a lot of German vineyard names describe something in that area, yeah, to make it recognizable. And anyway, so Kirschegg is one of the vineyards that was first mentioned. I don't know the exact date, but around 1500, because a monk in a church or something like that, they wrote down, okay, they have like the good wine from the Kirchenheck. During that time, the name was a little bit different, but it was mentioned that they have the good wine from that site now here in the monastery. And so that's why we know that for sure, like minimum like 500-600 years, wine is growing in that area. Yeah. Yeah. And that's basically a little bit of the history of that site.
Cool. And then the Hallenpfad, is it just that steep and that's why it has that name? And could you share what the translation is as well?
Yeah. So Hallenpfad is for us a little bit of a newer vineyard. I bought it in the 2007 or 8, but it belonged to the family before. So my father's sister, she married also into a winery, and they were farming like the Hallenpfad for over 150 years, more or less. And it has a very, very long history of producing extremely good wines. And I had the chance of buying up an old cellar with some bottles from like the 20s, 30s, 40s. And in the cellar, there were a lot of bottles from different producers from this Hallenpfad vineyard. And they all stood out compared to all the other bottlings that were laying around there. And then I had more interest in that vineyard. And the Hallenpfad itself, it means path to hell. Yeah. The translation. And here, what's interesting is here we have, it's the only vineyard in the whole Nahe area where we have like this red sandstone soil, so red slate. Similar to in Germany, you find it in other places as well. For example, in Rheinhessen, there's like the famous Niersteiner Hang, the Rote Hang, it's called. Yeah, it's around Nierstein, a lot of famous sites there, and it's a kind of similar soil. And the Hallenpfad is the only vineyard here in the Nahe where we have this type of soil. So there's red sandstone soil. The red color comes from oxidized iron. So it's a very mineral-rich soil. And so the local people, they called it always like Hallenpfad, so path to hell, because there was like a little path over that mountain range. It's super steep, and with the red soil, so, red, the color, like similar to like fire in the hell or something like that. And we don't know exactly, but we think when they traveling to the other village, they had to go over that mountain. During the summertime, the red soil, super steep, hot, so they called it like the path to hell, more or less. And yeah, for us, super, super interesting, especially with this type of soil. And then I had the chance in 2007, 2008 to buy the vineyard. And since then, I'm producing a dry Riesling there. So in the first 2-3 years, we made a lot of experience. What can we produce? What type of wine style can we do in that vineyard? It's more like a Kabinett off-dry or Spätlese or more dry wine, stuff like this. And this takes time. So the first 3-4 years, we just did some trials in the cellar to figure out what we can do best. And then we figured out, okay, dry wines just works in that vineyard. And then since 2011, we're making dry wines there. Yeah. And as I said, super interesting. The soil gives us a different flavor profile. It's more like herbal that we normally don't have like on the slate soils. The slate soil wines are more like salty tasting. Yeah. And this one is extremely herbal and stands out. And it's a nice addition to the portfolio.
Thinking about the history that you guys have gone down, and you said that your father obviously was kicked off the expansion, opportunistic acquisitions, a bunch of vineyards. And this doesn't have to be something that you do in the next 5 or 10 years, but do you ever imagine being involved in vineyard sites outside of Germany, or are you already at all?
Oh, no, not really. Outside of Germany, no. This is the time management. At the moment, really, I'm happy what I'm doing, and it's for me, it's what I want to do. Mm-hmm. I like to be in the vineyards. I like to be working in the cellar, and I don't have time to travel somewhere else to do that. Yeah.
Okay. A reshaped version of that question: if you could produce wine from any area of Germany other than where you're at now, where would you try and do that from, and why?
Oh, Jesus, there's so many interesting places here. But I guess I would go something completely different. So I wouldn't go to the Mosel or to the Rheingau or Rheinhessen or Pfalz or something like that because it's more or less the same kind of. Yeah, I would go like to Baden or somewhere totally to the south, different climate, different grape varietals, a different challenge, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think were the most interesting wines maybe coming out of regions like that versus the ones that everyone can name off the top of their head right now, or in terms of experimentation?
That's a very personal taste at the end of the day. No, I would, for me, because it's so completely different. It's more like Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, obviously Pinot Noir. And this is something we have here and there, but it's not the focus in the Nahe region. Nahe is basically Riesling, yeah. And there, for example, on the Kaiserstuhl, somewhere in Baden, the focus is on Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Weißburgunder, Grauburgunder, and that would make it for me so interesting that at the end of the day.
Awesome. Well, I was going to build a little bit on Brady's question, but I think you've already answered it a little bit more. I was just going to say, I think your experimentation is more just dealing with how to produce Dönnhoff style wines and the best wines with the current climate and that change. I feel like that's enough of your hands full rather than mixing in new varieties.
Yeah, no, definitely. So it always sounds a little bit weird, but I'm not producing wines for you guys or for somebody else. Yeah. And in the beginning, we're producing it, and I have to say we, because the team, I'm not doing the job alone, obviously. Yeah. So we like to produce the wines how we like them. Yeah. What we think, what our taste is. If somebody would come to me and tell me, okay, can you produce a wine that tastes like this? I couldn't do it. Yeah. This is my personal and the taste of like my family members and of my team. Yeah. And that's what we like this very pure fruit driven wines. For example, I like also drinking some other wines. I like productive wines sometimes and stuff like this. But for me, what is important is when I go into the vineyard during the harvest and eat a grape, and that flavor I want in the finished bottle. Yeah. And I have never tasted a grape in the vineyard that tasted reductive. So
that makes sense. One last wrapping up question here, then. This is probably a lot longer, but how do you guys go about your vinification process and aging? Is it in the large, like food, or not food, or it would be, basically your large barrels that you guys have there? Or is it like, how do you maintain that freshness while also not having like an oxidized character as well?
Yeah, it's a very traditional winemaking, what we're doing. Yeah. So obviously we have now new machineries, new pumps, new hoses, new presses and stuff like this. Yeah. But in the end, the system is still the same that my grandfather used to do. Yeah. So first of all, obviously we need healthy grapes, healthy vineyards, healthy grapes. Without that, nothing is going to work out. Yeah. And then another thing that is extremely important is the day of the harvest. Yeah. You want to catch that perfect day when you have like physiological ripeness, when you have the aromas are there and you have this nice crisp acidity and then not too high sugar ripeness. We are working towards the goal during the summer in terms of all kind of different stuff that you're doing in the vineyard, like canopy management, leaf plucking, green harvest, stuff like this. Yeah. Every year is a little bit different, but we always try to work towards that goal. And then it's pretty simple. It gets hand harvested. We crush the grapes, but we don't destem them. Yeah. And we crush them just a tiny, tiny bit, that a berry that it pops open, and then that we can press it with like a lower pressure, and our press cycles are quite fast. Yeah. There's everything now like up to 12 hours, stuff like this. No, for us it's 1.5, maximum 2 hours done. Quite low pressure, not higher than 1.2 bars. Depends a little bit on the vintage. Yeah. And then the juice flows into the cellar. Everything until now is with gravity. Yeah. So we don't pump any grapes or also the juice. Everything goes by gravity into the cellar. Then very simple, we just let it settle overnight to get rid of the solids. Not too long because I want a little bit of cloudy juice, so maximum 12 hours. Yeah. And we don't add any sulfur or anything like that. Let it oxidize. And then on the next day, so after the settlement is finished, after the 12 hour, we rack it either like in stainless steel tanks or in wooden barrels. In our area, they're called Stückfass or Doppelstück. So that's either 1,200 liters or 2,500 liters. That's the traditional barrels we're having here in our area. And it depends a little bit on the vintage. For example, if you have a vintage with a little bit of a lower acidity, more goes into stainless steel because we want to keep the freshness. And if you have a vintage with like higher acidity and the wines need to open up a little bit more, then they go more into wooden barrels. So that depends now, but I can say that at least every wine is from the single vineyard wines is at one point in a wooden barrel. So either for fermentation or for storage afterwards, except maybe it's ice wines or TBAs where we harvest only extremely small quantities. Yeah. And then fermentation. After fermentation, we chill the barrels down. There's one racking after a couple of months, and then we let it settle another couple of months, one filtering, and then we bottle it. Yeah, so it's pretty easy at the end of the day. Pretty simple.
Yeah, wow. That makes a lot of sense. And also, I think it's interesting. There's so many people here talking about trying to maintain fruit purity, and I think Dönnhoff has some of the most pure fruit of any wines you could say in the world. And you do have that little stage of cold or of settling without SO2 and then letting the top layer oxidize a little bit before racking. I think there's something that winemakers who just go so intensely into like sanitation and cold and protective winemaking, especially here in the US, to maintain fruit could learn from in the long run, for sure.
Yeah, the thing is, the things that work here in my winery for us doesn't mean that it would be for, I don't know, Jeffrey Crosset in the Clare Valley. Yeah, I guess not. That is our system that over the years that my grandfather, my father, and I worked there, we just fine-tuned here and there some things, yeah. But for us, it always worked, yeah. I get the question quite often. I have apprentices from all over the world all the time, and they sometimes they're in disbelief. They're like, "Wait, that's all you do?" And I said, "Yes, that's all we do exactly. Yeah, we don't do much." Yeah. One critical factor, I wasn't going so much into detail, but it's time. Yeah. When do you do your things you have to do? Yeah. When are you racking? When are you taking the lees out? When are you going to filter it? And stuff like this is, in my opinion, extremely important. And so, yeah, the time management is, I think, one thing people have to think about a little bit more, you know.
In terms of storage, you mentioned that you're not going to be expanding because of bandwidth, managing and working in the vineyards. How does the winery space? Do you guys have space if you wanted to make more wine?
Yes, the winery in general is much bigger, so we could store nearly the double amount of juice of wine in the winery. The reason is basically I have, for my single vineyard wines, I have enough storage that I could store the vintage of my single vineyard wines either in stainless steel or in wooden barrels. So in our traditional like Stück or Doppelstück barrels that we're having here in the Nahe. And the reason behind it is pretty simple. We work like 1 year to produce the grapes or produce the juice at the end. And then if I would like that juice in a wooden barrel and I wouldn't have one empty, that would be like stupid at the end of the day. Yeah, we would make a compromise that we don't want to make. Over the last 20 years or so, we invested like a lot in new wooden barrels and also in stainless steel tanks, so that we have always the choice when we want. Yeah, we can always store a specific wine either in wood or in stainless steel, and we don't have to make any compromises there. And I think that is extremely important for us, at least in the winery.
How long, and you don't have to say for every wine because I know it'll vary, how long do each wine stay in either tank or cask or big barrel?
Once again, that depends on the vintage. You can't really say it like that. Sometimes it's half a year, sometimes it's like only a couple of weeks, yeah. It depends on the development. Sometimes we see, for example, that after fermentation, when we have a fermentation in stainless steel, and after fermentation, they're quite closed. So we still leave it on the full lease for always like minimum like 3 to 4 months. But at some point, when after that it's still too close, then we rack it into wooden barrels. And there the development sometimes can go extremely quickly. Yeah. So after you taste that again after a couple of weeks, and then suddenly it's a completely different wine. So it already worked. And sometimes also it takes a little bit longer. So it's hard to say in general because every vintage and also every vineyard is so completely different. Yeah. But normally I would say until we bottle the wines, it's Yeah, at least 2 to 3 months in a wooden barrel, always the Rieslings. Yeah.
Does it vary based on your just general estate wines to your single vineyards, or again, is it like really site specific and
Site specific. Yeah.
cool? And then what's the longest you've ever done? I guess is my question, because those are relatively short times.
Oh,
in
the
grand
longest
scheme
one,
of
yeah.
things.
The longest one is a couple of years, like 4 or 5 years, something like that.
And then that was just because it was a highly acidic vintage, or what drove the need to keep
A
that?
different idea.
It was for style.
We have, as a winemaker, you always have sometimes stupid ideas during harvest, or some things that you tasted somewhere else and want to try it. And then, for example, in 2018, we had from Hermannswille, I had one barrel that didn't ferment completely, so it had a little bit got stuck at like 10 grams of sugar or something like that, 10 grams per liter. It's not a lot, but just above the dry level. And so the question was then in spring or during summer, are we bottling it? And then, to be honest, at some point we forgot it. Yeah, so we were bottling all the dry wines, the GGs, and then I had always like this one barrel, but then I didn't have the bottles. And at some point, and then harvest was coming up, yeah, and then we're like, yeah, come on, we just leave it there. And then at the end, it was like 3 years, and then we bottled it and sold it. Stuff like this can happen. Yeah, sometimes it's a little bit of like by accident. Sometimes it's on purpose. Depends on the wine style that you want out of it at the end of the day.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for all of your time. This has been so insightful, and we're really happy to have you on. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
All right. That is our interview with Cornelius Dönnhoff. I hope everybody is as excited as I am to go try some of their single vineyard wines, whether it be for the first time or revisiting some now that you know more about what makes each of them special. And for now, that is our full episode for this week. We will be back with another 5 questions on Friday and a full episode next week. Cheers.